This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we go back now in history, Columbia University's Hamilton Hall, which students occupied just after midnight last night, we reported earlier, was also the site of a historic student occupation in 1968. It was actually on this day, April 30th, 1968, when hundreds of students at Columbia University started a revolt on campus. Students went on strike. They occupied 5 buildings, including the president's office in Low Library. The students barricaded themselves inside the buildings for days. They were protesting Columbia's ties to military research and plans to build a university gymnasium in a public park in Harlem. The protests began less than 3 weeks after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. The 1968 Columbia uprising inspired student protests across the country. This is an excerpt from the documentary Columbia Revolt by Third World Newsreel.
Students at Columbia moved to take over buildings despite warnings from campus officials.
To show the solidarity of people with 6 strike leaders who they tried to suspend, they decided to take Hamilton once again. Decided to stay.
The students then set up barricades inside the administration buildings.
First day in math, we set up a defense committee which took care of putting up the barricades. We decided what our policy would be toward police, toward jocks. We soaped some of the stairs. We taped the windows. We emptied bookcases and put them up in front of the windows in case tear gas canisters did get through the tape.
And it hung up a lot of people when there'd be a little scratch or mar on one of the marble-top desks or something. At the second time we built barricades, these hang-ups had disappeared, and we had decided that barricades were necessary politically and strategically, and anything went in making strong and, this time, permanent-type barricades.
The defense is all taken care of. Security is a problem. Letting people in and out of the buildings. Watches. We need people to watch the windows every night.
We had a walkie-talkie set up, citizens band walkie-talkies. Plus, there were telephone communications to every building, which the university tapped. We had 3 mimeographs that worked constantly, and there were people who did nothing during the strike but relate to the mimeograph machine. And there was a big sign on the wall, quote from somebody in Berkeley, which says, 5 students and a mimeograph machine can do more harm to a university than an army.
An excerpt from the documentary Columbia Revolt by Third World Newsreel about 1968. Juan Gonzalez, Democracy Now! Co-host, introduced that tape when we first aired it on Democracy Now! On the 40th anniversary of the Columbia 1968 strike. Juan Gonzalez was one of the founders of the Young Lords and one of the leaders of the Columbia Student Revolt in 1968. Yes, in 2008, on that 40th anniversary, we spoke with a number of the activists involved in the Columbia strike, including William Sales, who was a leader of the Student Afro-American Society at Columbia, and then the chair of African-American Studies at Seton Hall University in New Jersey, as well as Gus Reisbach, who was a leading figure in Students for a Democratic Society at Columbia in 1968, then became a New York State Supreme Court judge in Brooklyn. We began the conversation with Juan Gonzalez speaking on that 40th anniversary of the student strike and takeover of Hamilton Hall.
We want to go into the dorms with all of you, with some of you who may not agree with a lot of what we've been saying here, who have questions, who support us, who want to know more. Let's go to the dorms. Let's talk quietly in small groups. We'll be there, and everyone in Livingston and about the issues involved, and we'll talk about where this country is going and where this university is going and what it's doing in this society and what we would like it to do and how we would like to exchange with you our ideas over it. Come join us now.
That was Juan Gonzalez, courtesy of the Pacifica Radio Archives. Juan, you speaking 40 years ago, explain the context.
Well, in the process of trying to build the strike, we were going into all the various dorms of the students and holding what SDS used to hold a lot of in those days, which were discussion groups or political discussions, group discussions, and we were trying to win over more people to the strike at that period of time. And this was after, obviously, the major police occupation of the campus, which occurred on April 30th. And as throughout the rest of the semester, there was a strike that shut down the entire university for the rest of the year.
So Gus Reichbach, now a judge, then a leader of SDS. Please set the scene for us. How did this happen? Where were you before the strike?
Well, I was one of the few law students who was involved in campus activity, anti-war activity, anti-gym activity. The actual event itself was a spontaneous one in terms of the actual occupation of the buildings. But the predicate for it was really years of organizing on the campus, really beginning in 1964. The year before, there had been a big demonstration about recruitment and ROTC. The gym was becoming an escalating issue. People were getting more and more responsive to the protests of the local community in Harlem who was opposing the gym. So, we're often given, I'm happy to say, more credit than we deserve in the sense that this was seen as a well-calculated plot, where at any point along that day, things might have taken a different turn. In fact, probably if Dean Coleman in Hamilton Hall had opened his door and received a petition, the occupation may never have occurred. So things proceed in peculiar ways, but even though the events were unplanned, the lead-up involves years of organizing.
You mentioned 64, Bill Sales. 65, Malcolm X was gunned down not far from there. Now, actually, at the Audubon Ballroom, that's been taken over by a new building, the Columbia University Biotech building, also very controversial. Did that play a role, though that was 3 years before?
The Students Afro-American Society has very definite links to Malcolm X through the son of Kenneth Clark, Hilton Clark, who was one of the founding members of that organization, was very much inspired by Malcolm X. SAAS always had a distinctly black nationalist aura about it. That was basically its guiding principle. So we saw ourselves as being in a tradition that had been highlighted by Malcolm X. When we actually took over Hamilton Hall, we renamed it Nat Turner Hall of Malcolm X University.
Explain who Nat Turner was.
Nat Turner was a slave preacher who in 1831 in Southampton County, Virginia, led the largest slave revolt on the North American mainland.
Bill, one of the things I think that most people are not aware of, because sometimes they don't connect all of the events that leading up to a particular crisis, was the climate. As I've often mentioned, this strike or the occupation began less than 3 weeks after the King assassination, and the impact on young people then, not only of the assassination, but of the disturbances and rebellions that broke out in over 100 cities across the country. I don't know if any of you want to talk about what the climate for young people was at that moment, at that particular moment in history.
Well, I certainly can speak to the African American experience, and it's certainly what made it an important experience was that for the first time that others than African Americans were also being caught up in that energy. But most of the people in Hamilton Hall had been in one or another urban rebellion. For instance, you mentioned the King assassination. That very night, I and Ray Brown and other people would go on to play leadership roles in the Takeover, who were on 125th Street. First time anybody ever shot at me, it was a policeman shooting over my head on 125th Street as various stores went up in flames. We were also much earlier that previous summer in Newark, during the Newark rebellions. We had raised funds in support of the families of students killed on February the 8th, I think, at Orangeburg, South Carolina State. So there was a continuous involvement in the turmoils of the day that incorporated larger and larger numbers of people who ultimately would take over those buildings.
That was William Sales, leader of the Student Afro-American Society at Columbia in 1968, then the chair of African-American Studies at Seton Hall University in New Jersey, and Gus Reisbach, who was a leader in Students for a Democratic Society at Columbia in 1968. He was a Columbia law student, then a New York State Supreme Court judge in Brooklyn. Tom Hayden was also there to see our full interview on the 40th anniversary of the Columbia Revolt, along with Juan Gonzalez. You can go to democracynow.org.